Good day. Over the last 5 years, we have been hearing in the United States a constant drumbeat about Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election and Russian interference in US politics generally. The reality is that when subjected to scrutiny, these allegations of Russian interference, which made up the bulk of the Mueller investigation, have never really been substantiated in any very great way. There is now a universal acceptance, except on the part of a few people, that the allegations of collusion between Donald Trump's campaign and the Russians in the run-up to the 2016 election were untrue. Having said that, it's perhaps interesting to compare the very overt interference of the United States in Russian domestic politics, which inevitably is provoking a strong pushback from the Russians themselves. I say overt US interference in Russian politics because, in fact, the United States makes no real effort to conceal its interference in those politics. We have just had a good example of this with the protests which took place over the weekend in Russia, connected to the return to Russia and arrest and temporary detention of the Russian blogger Alexei Navalny. Now, what was interesting about these protests is the way in which they were massively supported, first of all, by US social media. Some of you may have seen, in fact, it's actually, for those who are interested in political questions, almost impossible to avoid, a video which has been circulating on YouTube and which was circulating on a massive scale, which was promoted by Navalny's organization, which made all kinds of allegations that Vladimir Putin owns a gigantic palace on the Black Sea. It came with striking photographs of that palace or alleged palace, and with photos or alleged photos of its interior. Now, I'm just going to very briefly touch on this top story because it's been discussed at some length, and I noticed that it's been recycled and spoken about as true in various sections of the Western media. This despite the fact that Putin, through his spokesman, has vigorously denied that he has any connection to this alleged or so-called palace, and claims, almost certainly truthfully, never to have stepped his foot inside it. In fact, this allegation about this alleged palace goes back to 2010 and was subjected to a detailed investigation by no less an agency than the Financial Times in 2011. The allegations that Putin was involved were found by the Financial Times to have little or no substance. The documents produced in order to prove it did not in fact link to Putin directly. And it seems that this building, which may not be in fact a palace, was the brainchild of a St. Petersburg businessman called Nikolai Shamalov, and with the only obvious connection to Putin being the fact that Shamalov, for a time, was married to Putin's daughter. The palace or building was actually sold by Shamalov and the group of businessmen that he worked with to build this so-called palace in 2013 to yet another Russian businessman who has no actual connection to Putin at all. Shamalov, in fact, and Putin's daughter have divorced, and apparently that divorce was somewhat acrimonious, and Putin and Shamalov are not on good terms. So it seems that this entire allegation was not based on very much evidence, and in fact has already been largely debunked 10 years ago by the Financial Times. It is in fact not uncommon for Navalny and his organisation to do this, to make sensational allegations of corruption, which are under-investigated and are often, on closer investigation, proved to be unfounded. As for the photos which appear in the video, the photos of the interior are not actually photos of the interior. They are reconstructions of what the interior is supposed to look like, some of them clearly created through Photoshop. Having said that, this video was given an enormous amount of attention and was heavily promoted by US social media, and as a consequence it obtained millions of views, many of them in Russia itself. On top of that, there was an extraordinary and a very unusual step taken by the US Embassy the day before the protest, in which it published a detailed itinerary providing a timetable of when the protests would occur and where those protests would occur across the whole of Russia. Now, the US Embassy has justified this by arguing that its purpose was to deter US citizens, or at least to inform US citizens of where these protests would be, so that they would not themselves become involved in them and face whatever risk of violence or detention might come from that. The Russians don't accept that explanation. I don't think most people looking at this would accept it either. The itineraries provided are exceptionally detailed, and the timings are exceptionally precise, far more so than would be necessary in order to provide that sort of warning to US citizens. In fact, most Russians see this, or at least the Russian authorities see the publication of this information as intended to provide an overt signal that the US was backing those protests, which of course it subsequently did in further announcements that were made after the protests took place. So the Russians consider looking at this extraordinary promotion of this video that makes sensational and almost certainly untrue allegations about their president, and seeing the publication by the US Embassy of the timetable and itinerary of the protests, are very understandably accusing the US of interfering in Russian domestic politics. And of course, if something like that were happening, it were being done by the Russians in the US, I have no doubt that the same sort of criticisms by the US authorities would be made, and on this occasion, rightly so. Just imagine if the Russians circulated a sensational and untrue video making similar allegations against a prominent US politicians, say Nancy Pelosi or Hillary Clinton, or indeed Adam Schiff or Joe Biden or someone like that. And let's also assume or try to imagine that on the eve of protests, say the kind of protests that took place in Washington, D.C. on 6th January, let's imagine the Russian embassy in Washington publishing a detailed timetable and itinerary of those protests, the US authorities would be absolutely outraged, and rightly so, and the US media would be in a state of, well, almost meltdown over something like that. And again, it has to be said, it should be said, rightly so. But when it comes to US activities in Russia, that doesn't seem to apply. No one in the US seems to be bothered or concerned, and no doubt this kind of thing is going to continue. Now, I'm going to say something about this. Many Russians and many foreign commentators see this very open US backing for these protests and for Navalny himself as indicating US support, not just US support for Navalny, but indications of a US attempt to destabilize the political situation in Russia itself and perhaps stir up a color revolution there. And some of the feverish articles that have been appearing over the last few days, including one by the former US ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who is a known and passionate critic of Vladimir Putin's, would lend credence to that theory. All I can say is that if that is the plan, if that is why the US is backing these protests, then it needs to take a step back and look at what actually happened. There's been much coverage of the protests in the Western media, especially, dare I say, in the media in Britain and in Germany, less so, in fact, in the US. There has been some wild talk about a protest tidal wave sweeping across Russia from the east to the west. The actual expression tidal wave was used in an editorial comment about the protests in The Guardian. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's obviously debate and discussion about how big these protests were, but the consensus view from people who were following the protests, at least the one in Moscow, and who were, some of them, actually on the scene, is that the number of protesters in Moscow was no more than about 20,000, and possibly less than that. Moreover, it seems that between 30 and 40% of these protesters, by most guesstimates, might have been, were school-aged children. Moreover, if one actually checks out the number of protesters who came out across the entirety of Russia, from the Far East all the way to the west, from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad, it's unlikely that more than about 50,000 people protested everywhere. That's the entire number, including in Moscow. It's going to be impossible to claim that this is a tidal wave. It makes no sense to do so. It was more, dare I say it, a ripple on the placid surface of Russian politics. Most Russians do not support Navalny. Every opinion poll, including independent opinion polls, confirm that his support or sympathy for him in Russia is in the low single figures, and that might even overestimate the level of support that actually is for him. And that these protests simply do not a colour revolution make. As one commentator, Anatoly Karlin, who follows these protests carefully, correctly wrote, a large number of a group of children meeting together in Moscow surrounded by liberal journalists, is not going to shake the Kremlin. And that is absolutely true. So what does the United States actually gain from all this promotion of a protest movement that is not going to achieve anything? There have been protests in Russia before. There were much bigger protests in 2011. There was protests in 2017. A fair number of people have come out. Not many thousands if you add them all together across Russia. The protests have then died down and things go back to being very much as before. Within Russia itself, these protests do not make a vast difference or a great amount of attention. But what they do achieve is great anger on the part of the Russian authorities towards the United States. If the US is angry about fictional Russian interference in US politics, how much more angry must the Russians be about actual US interference in their politics? It seems to me that this is a vast investment of time and energy and resources in order to do something. I'm not quite sure what, but whatever it is plainly counterproductive. I do wonder whether this support for Navalny and indeed for other protest leaders in Moscow who rise up from time to time isn't more the product of bureaucratic inertia within some parts of the US intelligence community and active measures community than it is part of any really deep-laid strategy. Whatever it is, this policy should be stopped and reversed because all it is doing is creating tension between the one country, Russia, which is capable, along with the United States, of ending life everywhere. Russia and the United States have enough problems between them as it is, not to add to those problems by this meddling, which in all other respects will achieve nothing. Thank you very much for joining me on this program. Please come to our other programs on our various channels, my own channel, the main Duran channel, Alex Christoforou's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also come to our shop, buy the great products that you will find there, our famous Duran magic mugs. Since we're talking about Russia, here's one with the Russian flag. We have the flags of many countries on our magic mugs, on our shirts, on our famous t-shirts. You see that I have here the Canadian symbol. You'll find, by the way, that we have great t-shirts, long-sleeved and short-sleeved. We have hoodies and hats and sweatshirts. And please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Rumble, Odyssey, Library, and the rest. And last but not least, support us if you can on Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. And please join me in my next broadcast. Thank you.